So another message in a bottle from the desert island of being. Um, I think that we have to tackle this scientism question, because by doing so we can juxtapose it to the most advanced outposts in thought. Um, so for scientism, I'm going to use the figure of Sam Harris. I think Sam Harris is sort of the lowest possible level, which still remains um, roughly within the ambit of intelligent discussion. Um, and at the risk of discrediting myself, which I know I will with certain um, part of the thinking community, um, I must say that I think that one can see his personality, in the sense that Jung spoke of seeing personality, by which I mean not through a tabulation, what comes from a standard aptitude test or the Big Five test or the things Jordan Peterson speaks about, which um, I don't, which in a way, how we should regard those are the subject of this current recording, um, but directly through intuition of the essence. I think we can see that there are certain personalities around which certain views collect, and they come to their full point, and we can compare them to other personalities. I think there's something in Sam Harris, which is sort of an engineering mentality, and you see it, which is in a certain sense somewhat rare in a personality which, on the whole, is directly superior, I believe, at least from first glance of intuiting the essence, to use a technical phrase, but it just means you recognize this thing is say a ginkgo tree by the leaves, for instance, and the distinctive color. Um, and then at a more fine level of discernment, you can recognize other things such as personality types. And however new age and ridiculous it may sound at a certain level, I can only say what seems self-evident to myself and give that over as evidence. I know that it's we have, of course, the saying of Nietzsche that a casual stroll through the lunatic asylum will tell us that mere belief is not enough to tell us that we're dealing with the truth. But on the other hand, it's um, in extremis, there's nothing else that we can do but ask for veracity and testimony of what from some Dasein. So it does seem to me that Peter Thiel is an engineering personality, but simply of a higher order and therefore simply superior to Sam Harris, except as it seems to me that maybe there's 6 months or so different in their age in the favor of Harris. Um, of course, there's other factors like what information they've been exposed to, but in a simple sense, their educations are fairly comparable, even if Thiel left the university earlier, which may be to his credit because he was more intelligent, given the conditions of the current university. So to begin with, I want to say that it seems to me that we have these, in this worldview sense, in the sense that a worldview may mark corruption from a more direct view of the matters that Heidegger is trying to get to. Although I'm going to, in subsequent recordings, I'm going to try to contrast Heidegger with Nietzsche and Strauss. But so far as I'm making this feint, the purpose is that Heidegger says we have to deal with the necessary if we're going to reach the inception. So the necessary here is this scientism issue and the tech, and ultimately the technological essence. But I think the scientism is sort of the outside or the lower level of it, which in some ways corrupts us and ruins us intellectually when we're too influenced by it. So therefore, by analyzing someone like Harris, who, after all, stands in some proximity to the view of a good proportion of the human population, it can help us. The way I'm going to try to approach it is through an analysis of misused terminology. I take take over this method from Leo Strauss. Strauss, for example, was very wont to speak of the way that we assign the idea of the ideal to the Greeks, where it doesn't appear at all. Plato speaks of the idea, which is the same in Greek as in English, idea, but often also of the eidos, eidos, but those are just two parts of the same word. They correspond to the Latin species, and I think the species comes all the way down to Darwin, and you see it in the title of his famous book. With some complications, you can see that this is also contrasted with the Latin genus, except that in the alternative title to his famous book, he speaks of the favored races instead of the origin of the species. Races, however, in Latin is genus. So, in fact, Darwin himself has created this difficulty where race means something totally different prior to Darwin than it does before Darwin, with maybe some modification through the Christian period. But in any case, what we're basically talking about in Plato is species. So just to give a 1 part in 1,000 of uncanniness, I would remark that Darwin speaks of species of cabbages. So I think that's a little bit unusual for, we would say, what kind of cabbages do you have? What varieties do you have? In current English usage, it would be somewhat self-conscious if we were to say what species of cabbages are available at the market. So that shows some change in the what's floating around in these words, which aren't just words, but are tiles in the a house of being, as it were. So, or maybe we shouldn't even say "as it were," but this is a direct saying of Heidegger. So Heidegger is trying to get past language, as Wittgenstein says. He once asked, "Is there anything outside language?" The tradition is tied to language through the logic, which then, logic means speech or speaking modified by certain rules, which certain people over the millennium has thought to be useful. But to go beyond language brings us into something different. But okay, let's not go sideways on this there into that excursus. But to continue with this theme, the way I want to exercise a terminological clarification, which aims at not ruining us intellectually for these thinking what the technological essence is through changing the Sam Harris terminology, where Sam Harris speaks of science on the one side and the story on the other side. So I think we should amend that and say, if we were starting from that position, and by amending it, we cast some light on the whole situation of where we should start in discussing it, and saying instead engineering, which if I hear of somebody promoting engineering, then I say, fine, that's good, let's have more of it. Engineering is good. But if you call it science, you imply something much higher. So Harris is pretending to have something more than he does, which makes a large part of the population senses that, even if only dimly, we sense that he's arguing for something more than what he can really provide. He says he has science, but really he only has engineering, or in the Heideggerian language, you'd have to go through a little bit of modification there to get to techne, pure empiricism without real insight, let's say. He claims to have something more than he has. So, but then on the other hand, he depreciates, let's say, all the subject matter Joseph Campbell goes into. He depreciates as story, quote unquote story. Of course, the Bible was called in the Hollywood phase the greatest story ever told, and that wasn't meant as to be depreciatory, but it's come to be sheer pejorative, right? So I think that instead of one were to say genius instead of story, then we can see what was meant. We could also say wisdom, but wisdom has some problems. Um, Genius also brings us into some intricacy, but I think it's a strong word. And then if you say, speak of genius, I say, let's have more of it. That's good. You talk of engineering, I say, let's have more of it. That's good. So then you'd kind of even out the Harris position, and he would cease to be um, a subject of constant, vigorous, and restless disputation. Um, in a certain sense, even at the level of the Brownian motion of the bodies of the so-called human beings that are um, criticizing him. Okay, unfortunately, there's not enough time here. I just wanted to add one more thing, which is that these views in that we have now seem to correspond in some way to industrial society, whereas the Socratic views self-consciously were a correspondence or an analogy with artisanal making. I don't have time to say exactly what that means. I'll say it in the next recording, but we should mention that Habermas says explicitly that Heidegger viewed Plato as having a sort of a maker god, a designer god, and he thought that was the mistake of Plato. Um, Socrates used to hang out not in the agora, but in a shoemaking shop and in other workshops on the edge of the agora, I believe, because the youth were not allowed to enter the agora properly. And has something to do with the origin of the idea of the teleological um, aetia, or what we call cause in a somewhat confusing way. You might call it reason. Um, and this is a kind of analogy on the idea that the shoemaker knows how to make the shoes, and the leather worker knows already the design he's going to bring to it. But whereas the sort of ideas we're dealing with now in the work the Weltbild have quite a bit to do with industrial society and the man putting the pin, the Adam Smith example of the stultification of the mind of the worker through constant repetition of idiot automaton activity.